Webinar series. My name is Bryden Ross, and I'm the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy here in the headquarters office in Lexington, Kentucky. Today's event, Challenges and Future Opportunities for States in Net Metering, will examine the rapidly changing landscape in the electric utility industry with the popularity of net metering programs. And our speakers today are uniquely qualified to speak both from an industry and regulatory perspective on the history behind the net metering programs, current and upcoming policy and regulatory trends, and a general overview of the myriad different solutions being proposed across the country. Our first speaker will be David Owens, the Vice President of Business Operations at the Edison Electric Institute, where he focuses on the strategic areas of energy supply, environment, energy delivery, energy services, and international affairs. Owens previously served as DEI's Senior Vice President for Finance, Regulation, and Power Supply, where he focused on Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act, or PURPA, and the Public Utilities Holding Company Act, the Federal Power Act, and several other federal policy initiatives, transmission access, and bulk power and transmission pricing. He's been with EEI since 1980, and he's represented the industry in areas of finance, rate making, regulation, accounting, and taxes. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree from Howard University and a master's degree in engineering administration from the George Washington University. Our second speaker will be David Wright, who recently retired from state government and is now the president of Wright Directions LLC, a strategic consulting and communications business. But for over 9 years, Wright served as a commissioner for the South Carolina Public Services Commission as a commissioner, and then as a chairman in 2012. In 2011, Wright was elected to serve as president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, where he served as a member of the executive committee and board of directors. And during his service as a commissioner, Wright was a member of the association's electricity committee, and the Washington Action Committee, and a member and past chairman of the subcommittee on nuclear issues and waste disposal. He's also the former president of the Southeastern Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. So needless to say, we've got a very accomplished set of experts on the line today, and we're fortunate to have them speak with us. Just a few quick reminders, and then we can get started. First of all, you will be in listen-only mode, but we encourage you to submit questions for our speakers as you have them. You'll see that on the right-hand side of your screen will be a chat box, so go ahead and punch those questions in, and we'll take them on a first-come, first-served basis, and we'll give them to our presenters after the presentations are done. Also, again, we'll be recorded today, but if you have any additional questions once the webinar is concluded, we provide the panelists' contact information, and we'll be happy to get you in touch with them afterwards and encourage you to reach out after today's session. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, David, and we can get started.
Thank you, and thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in this webinar today. But we can show the first slide. What I'd like to do is really give you just a very simplified explanation of distributed energy resource options. And I really want to stress the importance of the electric power grid. So I'm going to start out with some real fundamentals, and then I'm going to pick up steam. So if we look at what's happening, we're in a very exciting time in the electric industry. Our customers are gaining new distributed energy resource options, including distributed generation. And when I talk about distributed resource options, I talk about rooftop solar, I talk about combined heat and power, I talk about demand response. So there are a whole lot of new technologies that are evolving that our customers now have the option of using. So with the customer now having greater options for distributed resources, our structure and the operations of our distribution systems are changing as well, and they're becoming much smarter. So today we have a system where the customer can produce their own electricity and sell the excess back to the utility, but we also have what we call smart meters, and these smart meters enable the customer also to have two-way communication with the utility. We have 65 million smart meters that have been installed that help the customer understand every hour of the day how much energy they're using and what devices are using that energy. Let's go to the next slide. And so, again, the distributed generation component of all of this really is the small-scale on-site power generation located at or near the customer's home or businesses. So solar panels on the roof, energy storage devices, fuel cells, microturbines, small wind turbines, and combined heat and power systems I would describe as distributed generation. Next slide. So we have all of these changes in technologies now that give our customers options through distributed generation. We also have some public policies that are evolving throughout the states that are also encouraging our movement towards distributed generation. So for example, today we have 29 states and the District of Columbia that have mandatory renewable energy standards. We have 43 states that have what we call net energy metering policies. Now I'm going to explain the net energy metering policies in a minute. But again, my point is technologies are changing, our customers have a broad array of options, and public policies are helping to stimulate that development of options. I might also say too that one reason why the customer is looking at rooftop solar as an example is there's declining costs of PV. And then there are a whole range of new leasing models. I'm on the next slide, please. There's a whole range of new options that the customer has. So we have declining costs of PV. We have new leasing models that enable the customer with a third party to be able to finance and install rooftop solar. We have customers making the decision that they want to be green and they want to have their own power supply. And as I mentioned earlier, we have smart infrastructures that are also enhancing the customer's ability. We also know too that with recent storms that many customers want to have their own backup power supply, and with increasing concerns about cyber and physical security, there's also a momentum to move in this direction. Our Department of Defense, with our military bases, they also want to go green. Our President has indicated that he'd like to have our military bases 25% by 2025, 25% of their energy produced from green sources. And so they also are looking at ways through which they can serve themselves. And because of national security concerns, in the event of a major blackout, they want to make sure that they can separate their systems and still be self-contained to supply their own needs. We call that islanding. So my point is that there are a lot of factors that are contributing to this very important transition to a distributed generation. Let's go to the next slide. But I would need to, however, stress one point, and that is that the utility industry is a tremendous installer of renewable technologies. And what this slide seeks to do is to give you just a snapshot of what we are about in the utility business. If you look at this slide very carefully, and particularly the graph on the left side, you'll note that the bulk of the solar installations that have occurred have been installed by utilities. So we're a strong advocate, we're a strong user. However, we put in what we call utility scale solar. And what I've been talking to you about thus far has been distributed solar. These are residential consumers or commercial consumers putting rooftop solar on themselves. One evolving challenge as we move to solar is how do we integrate the distributive solar with the utility scale solar and other resources that the utility has. And we're going to talk about that momentarily. Let's go to the next slide. This is what we call a typical energy production and consumption graph. And the blue part of this graph shows the customer has rooftop solar, and it shows a 24-hour period where the customer, in fact, is producing their own electricity through rooftop solar. You will note from this that the blue area only covers less than 24 hours. That in the early morning hours, when the sun is shining, you can see the solar energy production increasing. And then you'll see it drops off in the evening hours. And you'll see the green space is where the traditional utility is providing energy to that customer who has rooftop solar. So no matter what time of the day, the utility resource is there 24/7. And you'll see from 7 o'clock up through 10 o'clock that the solar facility is providing some level of energy production to the customer. But after 10 o'clock, the sun has gone down, so the customer's got to rely on the utility. And also, during the period that customers come home from work, which are 6 to, and we call that the peak period, from 6 to 9 p.m., you'll know too that the solar or the rooftop solar facility is not available. So what's my point? My point is that rooftop solar is not available 24 hours a day. My point is that utility grid is available 24 hours a day. And that grid provides the opportunity for the customer to always have electricity. No matter what time of day, the customer is still connected to the grid and is able to get energy from the electric company. The blue part indicates the hours through which the solar facility is available to serve the customer. So the grid is critically important in providing electricity to the customer. Let's go to the next slide. So there's a big debate that's raging throughout the states. And that debate relates to what do we pay for the power supply that we get from the rooftop solar, and what do we pay the utility for the backup and the standby service that they provide the customer. So it's what we call a rate problem. Most rates recover a large share of the fixed costs through variable charges. In other words, when you get a bill, your electric bill will not differentiate totally what the fixed charges are, what the costs of the system are. But the bill will show you what the commodity charge are. We call it, it's a bundled bill. It doesn't separate out these costs. So one big issue in the dialogue is, let's redesign the rates so that we can clearly show the customer and show the DG provider what amount of energy they're getting from the grid and what the cost for that support that they're getting from the grid is. Net metering today basically says that if the customer has rooftop solar, they can sell the excess back to the utility, and the utility's got to pay them the retail rate. When they get electricity from the utility, they pay the utility the retail rate. So the debate is, doesn't the rooftop customer get electricity through use of the electric grid? And shouldn't the rooftop solar customer pay for that grid? If the rooftop customer does not make a contribution towards that grid, then it means that other customers have to pick up the slack. We call that cost shifting. Next slide. So there's a raging debate that's occurring throughout the states to reform the net metering policies so that the rooftop solar customer who's made the choice to put on rooftop solar, who is also leaning on the grid, makes the correct payment for the services that they're getting from the grid. New approaches for designing rates are being debated in California, in Colorado, in Minnesota, in a number of states. It's a very important discussion. And that discussion essentially says, let's be able to keep the lights on, but let's pay for the grid. Next slide. And that's essentially what I was describing. This slide seems to speak to it in a little bit more detail. The bottom line is that the rooftop solar customer is getting electricity through the transmission and distribution system. The rooftop solar customer needs to make a contribution to the cost of that system. If the rooftop customer does not, then it means that other customers are picking up the tab. And we think that that is unfair. Next slide. So prices to customers should be based upon the actual wholesale cost to provide electricity and the fixed cost of the energy delivery system. Remember I said when you produce electricity, there's the commodity and then there's the infrastructure. We are making the point that the commodity and the infrastructure costs need to be transparent. The customer needs to see that. We're also making the point that the commodity and the infrastructure costs need to be paid for by the customer that has rooftop solar. If the customer that has rooftop solar does not pay for that, then it means that other customers pay for it, and it means that there is a subsidy and a cost shifting that's occurring. We believe net metering hides all of these costs, and we believe it's very appropriate that state commissions begin to address this from a standpoint of fairness. We also believe that in order to integrate rooftop solar facilities requires us to make improvements to the overall distribution system with new metering, with new monitoring. We want to make sure that the rooftop solar customer has reliable electric service, so it means we've got to modernize the distribution system so it takes into account the need to integrate these sources, and it recognizes the increased costs associated with it. Next slide. This is a very highly politicized dialogue about net energy metering. And it's one that is raging in many states. And it's one that the general public does not understand. And I know it may appear to be a very complicated issue, but in my view, it's really pretty simplistic. And it's simplistic from the standpoint that I'm saying that if you are connected to the grid, you should pay for the grid. If you are using the grid to sell your excess energy as a rooftop customer would, you're using the grid, you should pay for the grid. If you are seeking to buy from the utility, you should pay for the power supply that you're getting from the utility. So even though it sounds like a complex issue, it's really pretty simple. Next slide. As I said, there's been a raging debate that's been occurring, and more recently, it's been a big issue in Arizona. In Arizona, it was concluded that there was cost shifting that was occurring. The non-distributed generation customers were paying for those who put on rooftop solar. And the Arizona Corporation Commission decided that that was not fair. But the Arizona Corporation Commission also recognized, and the utilities always recognize, the valuable contribution that is made through solar energy, through utility scale solar, and to preserve the option if a customer wants to build or to install a rooftop solar, they should have that right. But the Arizona Corporation Commission decided that it was very appropriate for those rooftop solar customers to begin to make a contribution towards the grid. And so they reached the conclusion that every customer's bill, every customer has rooftop solar, their bill would be increased by $5 a month to pay for that electric grid that is supporting their use of electricity and supporting their purchase of electricity from the utility. However, they were very sensitive to those customers that had rooftop solar, and so they grandfathered existing customers through the end of the year, and new customers will be considered. What the process will be taken up in a rate case that will be deliberated on this year. The Arizona Corporation Commission also felt it was very, very important for customers to get a better understanding when they were installing rooftop solar of what their rights are. So anyone that's purchasing a rooftop solar leasing facility, there is an affidavit that is signed by all customers to make sure they understand the consequences of their decision. We think that's only good because that's all a part of the truth about power supply providers. Let's go to the next slide. Now, many of you on this call may say, well, wait a minute. Rooftop solar or distributed generation really isn't something that's widespread. It's just beginning to evolve. So why, David Owens, are you raising so much cane about this? Well, I'm raising cane about it because of the issue of fairness, the issue of the grid, and then I look overseas at what's occurring in Europe. So let's talk a little bit about what's occurring in Germany. In Germany, as we know, they have what we call feed-in tariffs. And the German government has made a decision. They want 50% of all electricity produced from renewables by 2030 and 80% by 2050. Now, the challenge, however, is that the cost of moving in this direction is about $1.35 trillion over the next 25 years. And it has a substantial impact on pushing up rates to German customers. And so many customers are seeing substantial increases in their electricity bill. And some have even concluded that electricity, if this continues, it may be considered a luxury good. Let's go to the next slide. And many of the reviewers of what's occurring in Germany have really analogized this example, that if the German utilities wanted to buy electricity on the open market, it would have cost them $4 billion in 2013. But they're now forced to buy from rooftop solar customers, and it's costing $26 billion. So if you do the arithmetic, that's more than 6 times as much as it normally would cost. So why are we having this discussion? We're having this discussion to ensure that we get the rules right. If we are moving toward a system of more distributed resources, we believe it is critically important that we get the rules right at the front end. And the German experience tells us a lot. We also believe that you need to have all of the above. We need to not only have the use of renewable technologies, we also need to preserve nuclear and other types of technologies. Germany has made a decision that they want to phase out nuclear and they want to move increasingly to renewables. And so we are observing that it has substantial rate consequences. And it also has substantial consequences on how the overall power grid remains reliable. Let's go to the next slide. So there's a lot of dialogue occurring in the U.S., in individual states, about how we deal with this issue, how we encourage or assure that the fixed costs of the grid, the infrastructure costs are recovered as we move increasingly towards distributed resources. And how do we make sure that the commodity charge, the energy charges, also are recovered? Well, the best rate-making approach that I'm aware of is called a straight fixed variable pricing approach. That approach, which is used extensively in the gas industry, says, let's identify all the true costs. Let's identify the costs of the grid. Let's identify the costs of the fuel. And let's separate those costs, and let's make sure that the rates reflect those costs and the bills reflect those costs. And so to me, that's the best approach for dealing with this issue. But it's a heated debate. There are a number of other approaches. I represented to you in Arizona, they decided a minimum charge on the bill is one approach. There are other approaches that are being used. But increasingly, state commissions are now recognizing the importance of redesigning the rates, the importance of the grid, and the importance of giving the customers the options. If they want to pursue rooftop solar, they can. So let me conclude. We're in a significant period of transformation. We have a changing customer model where the customer wants the option to move to rooftop solar. We have a changing utility business model where the utility has got to now acknowledge and supports the customer having that option, but at the same time, the utility has the responsibility of keeping the lights on. And we're also in an important period of transformation where we recognize that the current regulatory model, the current rate design, will not work in the future. With two-way power flow, with two-way communication, with the customer now having an array of distributed resources, that we need a different regulatory model. The bottom line of this, the next slide, the bottom line of all of this is the electric grid. It delivers a valuable product essential to all of America. The power grid is the element that is helping this transformation. It's helping to integrate more efficient technologies. It's helping to make sure that we have a resilient power supply. Everyone who uses the grid should share equitably in the cost of maintaining it and keeping it operating reliable. And we think it's vital to our nation to have a diverse supply of safe and reliable electricity, and that the rate should be fair and affordable for all customers. And we also believe that the electric power grid is critical to that. So thank you for your time and attention, and I'm going to yield the floor now to David Wright.
Thank you. That was a good presentation, David. So good afternoon. I want to thank all of you for attending today, and I want to thank the Council of State Governments for inviting me as well. My name is David Wright, and although I'm not that old, I actually did serve in the South Carolina General Assembly for about 8 years last century after I served as mayor of my town. In 2003, I was elected, as you heard, to the Public Service Commission in South Carolina, and where I retired as chairman last May. And I was very active nationally for the 9 years that I served, almost 10, and I served as president of NARUC, which was a high honor. I was able to testify on at least 9 occasions before congressional committees, as well as before the EPA and FERC, on issues ranging from licensing and opening of Yucca Mountain to reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel, and from a mandatory renewable portfolio standard to reliability concerns resulting from the proposed EPA regulations. So my purpose today is to get you thinking, because a great deal of, if not everything, involved in integrating distributed generation into the grid in your states will more likely land in your lap as a legislator. Make no mistake, this issue can get complicated if you let it. So I encourage you to educate yourself and then keep your eye on the ball as you tackle the development or altering of solar policies or net metering policies in your state. If you want to see how complicated and politically charged the issue can get, all you need to do is go back and look at the recent history in Arizona, as you heard David talk about a minute ago, and in California as well, because it can get ugly, and it can get personal, and it can get muddled. So I've heard it said before that in order to know where you need to go, you need to know where you came from. And so there's a reason. Some of you may have forgotten this. Some of you may not know it at all. And some this may be something that's very obvious to you. But there's a reason why utilities were granted monopoly status in this country in the first place. More than 100 years ago, power companies had no boundaries, and they competed directly with each other for customer rights, and some of them right on the same street, each running their own set of lines down the same street to specific end users. And a lot of time it resulted in several sets of lines going down the same roads, crisscrossing all over the place, and to cherry pick off customers, and it even serving different customers next door to each other or whatever. And can you imagine the mess it had to be? Oh, unbelievable. It was also very inefficient and very expensive. So in an effort to make things more efficient and less expensive, utilities and the government agreed to give power companies a designated footprint or an area to serve, where they also had the obligation to serve the people in that area. In return, the power company became a regulated monopoly by the state, and they were guaranteed the ability to make a regulated profit. Utilities have the obligation to maintain and operate a reliable and safe grid too, because when a customer flips the switch, you expect the lights to come on. And if the lights don't come on, I can assure each of you, as state and local government officials, not just the utility, or commissioners who regulate it, you will live hard if you haven't already experienced that. Simply put, regulated utilities are in the business to generate and sell power. That is their job, and they've done it that way for more than 100 years. And because they are a regulated monopoly with an opportunity to make a regulated profit, they need to do it in a least cost way too. And that makes sense, because the cheaper they can provide electricity to their end users, the more of an opportunity they have to make a regulated profit. In addition, as a regulated monopoly, utilities have to prove their investments are prudent, and that what they are providing as a utility is just and reasonable and in the public interest. If it is not prudent, just and reasonable, or in the public interest, most likely they won't get cost recovery for that in base rates. So it sounds simple, and it's worked pretty good for more than 100 years, but today there are multiple outside forces putting pressure on regulated utilities. And those outside forces and pressures can no longer be ignored or absorbed by the utility. First, utility costs are rising. So why is this? Well, today, outside of the rising costs for regular operation and maintenance, utilities have to respond to EPA regs and to other environmental and local laws and mandates. In the case of EPA regs, many utilities are retiring or retrofitting existing coal plants. Some are able to convert existing coal sites or brownfield sites to natural gas. Many are having to site and build new sources of baseload generation. On top of that, many times this also includes the need to site new transmission lines or maybe to site new natural gas pipelines as well. And I don't know if you've had to experience this, but do you have any idea how long and how hard siting generation and transmission can take? I can tell you it's very time-consuming, it's very expensive, and it's not always successful. Add to that the economy we're experiencing now. The demand for electricity is no longer growing. In fact, demand is flat. Some would even argue it's falling. Some utilities are seeing their customer base grow, but usage is flat or even declining. As a result of rising operational and maintenance costs and flat to falling demand for electricity overall, customer bills can do only one thing, and they're going to go up. And as their bills go up, customers tend to get a little vocal. Utility service has traditionally been a one-way supply of power. Electricity was generated, moved along transmission lines, stepped down to voltages that are supplied to individual homes, businesses, and industries. The grid has always been maintained and paid for by all who need it, use it, or hope to use it. But during the last decade or so, customers have begun looking for ways to try to escape higher power bills. So they're asking the PSCs, they're asking governors, the Congress, state legislatures for more choices. And they're looking for options outside of their current utility provider as well. Today, when you hear the words distributed generation, most people think of solar, so let's just stay there for now. To a customer, at the moment, distributed generation implies more control of their own usage and their overall electricity bill. It also implies it is a green source of energy too. To a regulated utility, distributed generation usually means less power to be sold to that customer by the utility, plus additional costs to improve the grid in order to accommodate those who self-generate, and having readily available backup generation sources to ensure those utilizing solar can get power from the grid at night and during days when the sun isn't shining. So installing solar on the rooftop is not a zero-sum choice. It's either the customer or the utility, and regulators and state government officials need to recognize it in their respective states. And in states, the most important difference between the solar industry and the regulated utility is that you do not regulate solar. You only regulate investor-owned utilities. And for you as legislators, who are largely responsible for state policy, that's a problem you're going to have to deal with. The issues you will consider will cover everything from interconnection to net metering to third-party vendors to social concerns about the impact distributed generation policies you adopt will have on low-income households and those who can't afford to put solar panels on their homes. As a result of federal legislation, states have been required to adopt programs and regulations to allow net metering, which has allowed someone who self-generates electricity through rooftop solar to connect to the grid and sell their excess self-generated power back to the utility, and right now it's at a retail rate. And as you would probably figure, in the absence of a national energy policy, not all states have treated net metering the same either. The adoption of net metering programs highlighted another problem with the traditional grid. The moving of power is no longer one way. It now has to be able to handle two-way flow of energy. Traditional meters are not designed for that, nor are traditional transformers. In order to accommodate the two-way flow of electricity, utilities have had to adapt, figuring out how to make it work without jeopardizing the reliability of the grid as well as the safety of the utility worker, the homeowner, the installer, and emergency response personnel. In some areas, utilities have installed smart meters, you heard that earlier, that can handle some of this problem as well as provide safe interconnection. And they've also had to develop transformers to upgrade the transmission system. and distribution network to try to handle it as well. The problem is none of this is free. Additionally, distributed generation is not traditional AC power as you currently get from outlets in your home. In fact, solar is DC, not AC, so utilities have had to make changes to the transmission system in order to do this interconnection safely. In fact, safety is a huge concern in the potential integration of distributed generation to the grid. It does not just include the safety of the utility worker or the installer or the homeowner or the business owner or emergency response personnel, but it also has to protect the home and the actual business too. So states are going to have to adopt policies and regulations that ensure utilities are fairly treated and compensated because they are a regulated monopoly, who is also charged with the obligation to serve. And they are obligated to maintain a safe and reliable grid for all who need it or hope to use it. States are going to have to address and adopt policies that also recognize the true costs and impacts of these changes and upgrades as a result of the integration of distributed generation technology, and make sure laws, policies, and regulations are adopted that ensure that those who use or provide distributed generation pay the real and true cost associated with their choice of service in a transparent way. At the same time, states are going to have to ensure that users or providers of distributed generation are compensated fairly for any excess power that they send to the grid and for any identified improvements that they provide to the utility and the grid. And I'm not even going to address incentives or tax breaks or any other financial tool used to incent the growth of solar resources, but that will be another area states will have to study and grapple with in the adoption of their policies. Using solar as the example, when the sun isn't shining, those who use solar panels need a backup source of power, and that comes from the utility through the grid. The one thing that we all have in common are the wires and poles or the distribution network that provides power from the utility to our homes, to our businesses, our churches, our schools, when we need it. The question you need to answer is, what does it really cost to have access to the grid? So the grid is the one thing that is constant. It has to be available no matter what. As a result, it has to be reliable, safe, and maintained for everyone to use, no matter when it is needed or how it is used or what is needed from it. A regulated utility has the obligation to serve, so they have to be prepared to provide power to everyone connected to the system at any time, regardless of who they are or how much electricity they generate themselves. There is a serious cost to this, so policies have to be adopted to recognize and account for a recovery of these costs. State policy development is even more important today in a flat to declining demand for electricity market. Costs to operate and maintain the grid are going to continue going up. That means even higher prices to customers, which means ratepayers are going to continue to be vocal and ask for more options. So you get it, but if you're not careful in crafting your state laws and state policies, this situation can turn into a death spiral for your regulated utilities, which I can promise you will not be good for anyone. So before you go out and introduce any legislation, I would ask you to consider and take an initial and very important first step, and that is to collaborate. In Arizona, several things happened. Most important was that the Arizona Corporation Commission recognized that there is a cost shift for the cost of the grid being paid for by the non-solar customer. That, in effect, subsidizes the cost of the grid for the rooftop solar customer. They also decided that they could not wait 2 or 3 years to address the cost shift in a rate case because the impact would be much greater to customers. So they acted on it then. Minnesota is going through an exercise to identify the value of solar. Colorado and Georgia have begun policy work at their states. Like Arizona, California has also recognized there is indeed a cost shift between rooftop solar customers and those who do not utilize or can't afford to utilize rooftop. In my state of South Carolina, stakeholders are in the process of studying the impacts solar may have on the entire system as they look to revise and reform regulations or push legislation. Co-ops, regulated utilities, environmental groups, business and industry, the Public Service Commission, and public staff consumer advocates, legislators, the staff from the Labor, Commerce, and Industry Committees in both the House and Senate, attorneys who are specialized in utility law, accounting, and tax law, state energy offices, vendors, and others involved in policy making are meeting to learn and discuss everything involved in the process, even potential unintended consequences, all the way down to pricing. That doesn't mean they're going to agree on everything or that they will, but they are beginning to understand each other's concerns, and that can only help. That's my point. Everyone has to come together collaboratively, in your states too, in a combined effort towards finding solutions that will benefit everyone fairly and transparently. So I'd encourage you to do the same in your states, because this issue's coming. If it's not already there, it's coming sooner than you think. So please educate yourself on the issue, review and understand what you already have on the books in policy or law in your state, and why they were there, why those things are there to begin with, and identify what the desired goal and outcomes are for your state, because I assure you they're not going to be the same in every state. So again, I encourage you, when and where possible, bring all the stakeholders and interested parties together, hold educational meetings, workshops, get an understanding of what the task will entail before you start down the road. It's not going to stall the issue. It probably will help create solutions that can pass muster with legislatures, governors, offices of public utility commissions, and get it done quicker. So the list of questions you need to address is exhaustive, but it's worth the effort to find the answers to, because the future of providing safe, reliable, and affordable power to your citizens really depends on it. So that's my presentation, and I think we've got plenty of time for questions.
Okay, yes, no, I encourage you to continue to send those questions in, and I'll go ahead and address the first one we got. We will have a copy of the presentations online on CSG's website through our Knowledge Center. So if you just go to www.csg.org, you'll see the Knowledge Center screen there too, as well. So you can click on that and go through and access this presentation. It will take a few days to get the audio to go on with the physical slides, so you can have some context there. But yes, we will have the presentations up hopefully by the end of this week, no later than the beginning of next week, for you all. It really is a matter of editing the audio down to fit the presentations. With that, I'll go ahead and throw the first question up to the entire panel, and I'll let you guys take this, or if you both want to comment. Do net metering customers provide benefits to the grid? If so, how should that rate reflect that benefit?
Okay, let me take a crack at it. So first, if the net metering customer is providing benefits to the grid, we have to first understand what those benefits are. So let's take some hypotheticals. If the net metering customer is providing electricity back to the grid at the time that the utility would have its highest demand on the grid, then that means that that net metering customer is helping the utility reduce its need for capacity. So that distributive customer should be able to get a payment from the utility that gives them credit for capacity that the utility doesn't have to need to meet its peak demand. If it doesn't, it shouldn't get a capacity credit. If the net energy metering customer reduces the traffic on the grid and permits the flow of a lot more electricity, we call that removing or relieving congestion, then clearly it should be acknowledged that that's a benefit. But if the distributive energy customer says, I'm putting on rooftop solar to save to reduce the amount of carbon produced, the amount of carbon produced has nothing to do with the electric utility rate. We call that an externality. So if there are direct costs that are reduced for the utility, the distributive generator should get a credit for those direct costs that they reduce for the utility. If they do not, they should not get a credit. That's the issue of fairness.
David Wright, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think this kind of goes, I think, to the societal benefit question? Is that kind of where that seemed to be going? I just think that's a I think you start getting into that, you can talk about societal benefits in a lot of things. I mean, are affordable rates because you're keeping your generation mix, low cost. Is that a societal benefit? So I think you could take that anywhere. But I think that as long as the customer is getting credit for what they use or send back to the utility, and they're paying in a transparent way for the services that they get from the utility, I think that's the way to go. It's fair.
Okay. Our next question. The first speaker advocated a straight fixed variable approach whereby the price of grid costs are fixed and the price of fuel costs are variable. Does the speaker advocate this approach for both DER customers and traditional customers? In other words, should fixed grid costs only be applied to DER customers, or should it apply to all customers?
Okay, I said that the preferred approach, my preferred approach, would be a straight fixed variable rate, because what that does is it clearly identifies all the infrastructure related costs, and which we call fixed costs, and the non-fixed costs. And I said those costs have to be transparent. The customer's got to be able to see them. The utility's got to be able to clearly identify what those costs are. I said that is the soundest way of dealing with this issue. However, I also said that approach is not universally accepted, that it's an approach that's used in the gas industry. It's not an approach that's universally accepted in the electricity industry. The fundamental issue here is, how do you identify the actual costs that the customer is imposing on the system and the actual benefits the customer is getting from the system? So for a distributed generation customer, all customers, if you are benefiting the system, those costs have to be identified and you should get a credit. If you are adding costs to the system, then you need to pay for those costs. That's the fundamental point that I'm trying to make. They're fixed costs and they're non-fixed costs. You have to identify them and you have to pay for those costs. And there are a range of rate-making approaches that do this. There are approaches called buy-sell arrangements that do this. There are approaches that say charge a demand charge that do this. I gave the example of Arizona, where you don't recover all your fixed costs, but there's a minimum charge. So there are a whole range of approaches that are being used by state commissions. I said the most direct approach is a straight fixed variable approach, but I also acknowledge that's not widely acceptable.
The only thing that I'll add, just from a regulator perspective, former regulator, what you're really trying to, the point you're really trying to make here, and you want to be sure out of fairness, you don't want to make sure that one whole class of people is either not being charged for something that they're getting, or is being charged for something that they're not benefiting from. So, I think that's why you've got to really look at just the cost. What does it cost to have the grid up and running? That's the first thing. And if everybody's paying for the grid to be up and running, then unless you're totally disconnected from the grid and totally, then you don't. Then there's a cost somewhere, to have access to it.
Okay. Our next question is in relation to an earlier one regarding recouping direct costs, and the questioner wanted to know, does that really only apply to EPA compliance costs, and what else do you mean by direct costs?
Okay, let me respond to that, and then I would ask David Wright also to respond to it. I believe that I showed a slide that showed components of the electricity bill. Maybe I didn't. And there are all kinds of costs. There's the cost for the transmission system, which is a fixed cost. There's a cost for the distribution system, which is a fixed cost. There's a cost for the power plant, which is a fixed cost. All of those are fixed costs. There's a cost for backup and standby power supply, which is a fixed cost. All of those costs are today they're bundled in an overall rate. So you don't see those costs on your bill. What you see is your kilowatt hour payment. You don't see the breakout of the cost the way I described it. As we evolve to using more distributed generation, you've got to be able to identify the costs that are imposed on the system and the benefits that are derived to the system. So that means that you need to make all of those costs and benefits transparent so everyone can see them. That's the point that I was trying to make. So if, for example, if you're seeking to move off of coal, which produces CO2, to renewables, your bill would show the cost for the renewables. Your bill would show that there is a grid-related charge for the renewable. You wouldn't see any fuel costs, but you would see the cost for the renewable. To the degree that the renewable is not available, and if you're trying to comply with EPA rules, then it means that you've got to use other sources of power supply. And so the costs associated with those other sources of power supply to keep the lights on will also be reflected in the bill. The fixed cost and the fuel cost if you're not using a renewable.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of states that have on their bill is called a basic facilities charge or base facilities charge, and it's really an arbitrary number. It's one, it can get very it can get politically charged in rate case discussions too. But it's a number that's on the bill, but it's not really reflective of true cost of anything, except that it recovers some of the cost that's out there. But I think today's point, when you're getting into this debate now, and that's why it's becoming more, I guess, politically charged. The grid has to be maintained and ready for anybody and everybody to use it, no matter how they use it or what they want to get from it. And if it's not there, and it goes down, you know, it's serious for everyone. So there's certain things that the utility has to do because they have the obligation. They have to do this, and they have to make generation available. You know, the way they do it now, it's got to be, you know, it's on the highest use, you know, time of the year, time of the day. If they don't have that available, then there's a reliability problem. So, so there's a cost, and as we start doing what we have to do to integrate even more, you know, these costs have to be paid for. So the sooner we can identify and get all this explained to the customers, they'll be able to make a better informed decision on whether rooftop solar is the way to go, or if they want to go more utility scale with a utility. So this is all about giving the customer more information and to give them the tools they need to make an informed decision too. This, you know, I guess that's the point.
Okay, our next question. Why not have the utility provide an offset credit to the commodity charge for the DG customers selling to the utility? This would avoid all the fixed cost issues.
Well, David, you want to take that or you want me to respond?
You go ahead and hit it. I'm not sure I understood what he said.
Okay, I think what they're saying is, first I would take a little bit issue with the way the question is phrased. The question, in my view, assumes that there is the equivalence between the power supply from the distributed resource and the power supply from the utility. And nothing can be further from the truth. The power supply from the distributed resource does not have a network. It doesn't have a grid. It doesn't have other power plants that back it up. The power supply from the utility has an entire network, has backup and standby resources that back it up. So if you say there's a one-for-one credit, then you're making the assumption that the two are equivalent, and they're not. The power supply for the distributed resource is available 10 hours a day. The power supply from the utility is available 24/7. So the two are not equivalent. So you can't give them a direct credit. Can't give them a commodities credit. That was my fundamental point And that's really what the big debate about net metering is. There's this perception that the two are equivalent, and they're not. The utility has an entire network with fixed costs, with modern meters and sensors and all the elements that keep the system reliable. The distributed resource entity doesn't have any of that. And many of them don't even have battery backup. And so it means that they lean on the grid. So again, it would be inappropriate to give a credit, the same payment that the utility charges the customer, that's called the retail rate. It would be inappropriate to pay the customers that's producing energy and selling back to the grid to give them a retail rate credit. So I hope I'm clear in that. That's really the critical element in the dialogue, and that's where all the emotion has been generated, because some argue the two are equivalent, and they're not.
Yeah, I'd also add that during the 10 hours a day that Dave is saying that solar is available, it's not always available at 100% of the customer's need. So, you know, if it's ramping up early in the morning when the sun's coming up behind the trees or it's cloudy, they are not getting a 100% use of their solar panels to heat their home or to do their power, so they're having to pull power from the grid too. So, I mean, there is a cost for that. And, you know, unless the customer is totally not connected to the grid, there is a cost.
Okay, well, we're getting close on time. I think maybe we do one more quick question that I'd love to have both of your thoughts on, and then we'll wrap up. Are there any proposals out there in the rate world for a value of solar tariff that maybe could thread the needle here between some of these thorny issues? I know, David, you talked about, in your mind, the straight fixed variable pricing system being the best option forward. Are there other things that have been useful? I know Austin Energy has done this value of solar tariff that
yes.
That has been popular. I'd say popular. Has been that has been a little more well received than some other ideas from some solar advocates and installation companies. Is there a sweet spot there that either one of you could comment on that would work to kind of recognize that value that people are discussing, but also recognizes the cost you have as a utility?
Well, and I'm glad you raised the City of Austin. So there are a range of examples that are evolving. There's no perfect way to deal with the issue because it's going to vary from utility system to utility system and the type of customer that is employing rooftop solar. Every utility system has a unique design. But the City of Austin tariff and others have acknowledged some very important attributes and benefits of solar, and I don't discount them. I think many of them are real. I know that the Minnesota Commission is also looking into the issue. The California Commission is looking into the issue. So there's an evolving dialogue about the value of solar. But out of all of those dialogues, my view only, out of all of those dialogues, I don't think any of them have concluded that as much as you may identify the valuable attributes of solar, none of them have said that they totally discount the value of the grid. They do not totally offset the value of the grid. Some of those studies also, in my view, integrate societal benefits with actual costs. And I think that's where the dialogue has really got to be a little bit clearer, because there are externalities in everything we do in society. So you've got to be able to differentiate those that are true costs and true benefits. And I believe the dialogue is becoming more rich on that. I think the City of Austin tariff is a great start to look at this. The Minnesota proceeding, as I mentioned, the California proceedings are also looking to this issue. So this is an entire evolving area, and we're very, very open-minded. If there are true benefits, then those benefits need to be compensated.
Yeah, agreed. It's all about fairness, and nobody's trying to hurt any type of any generation source. We need them all, but you know, again, it's got the utility. The utility has to be safeguarded as well as the customer here, and that's why this whole discussion is critical. And every state is going to be different because your whole goals may just be different from state to state. So I agree with David that it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all.
Okay, well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time today and for sharing your insight. I want to remind our callers that the webinar, again, will be on the website through our Knowledge Center. If you have any follow-up questions, please send them to me, bross, B-R-O-S-S, at csg.org, and I'll be happy to send them over to David Owens and David Wright. Well, gentlemen, again, thank you for your time today, and with that, we'll conclude today's session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.